Actually, I'm a retired grandpa. When Margot and I had 10 grandchildren, when each one of them moved from primary 7 into S1, going into secondary school, I've written every one of them a grandpa letter of advice, on the basis, certainly which I've found true, they're more likely to listen to me than they are to their mothers and fathers. And I've also sat down and talked to them individually. I can make a claim to be a better economist than Alistair Darling, and I can prove it. If you want hilarious comedy, read Alistair Darling's budget speech before the crash. 3% rate of growth and the banking system in good condition. Now, while he was making that speech, I was making a speech to an audience of 300 at a conference organised by the Hollywood magazine. And I was warning them of the tsunami coming across the Atlantic. The Queen asked Darling, did no one see this coming? And of course, Alistair got off the hook saying, no, nobody saw it coming. That wasn't true. There's a Professor Rubini in New York whom they named Dr. Doom because he kept telling them what was going to happen. And I've got a Scottish economist friend who operates an economic analysis business in Hong Kong. And in 2007, he's very generous to me. I'm an old pal, so I get the stuff for nothing. He charges his clients about $100,000 a year. He sent me a document called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, with Alan Greenspan's face on one of the horses. He was the head of the Fed in America. And in October 2007, Jim told me exactly what was going to happen. So I was able to go to that conference, and I was very confident, even though I was retired, and I told them what was coming. The chairman of the conference was a guy called Michael Crowe, who at that time was the political editor of Scottish television, and who became the PR man for the Tory party. And as I sat down, Michael said to me, far too negative on the economy, that's nonsense. Well, I was right, Michael was wrong, and Alistair Darling, to say they would get 3% permanent rate of growth and the banking system was fine, just months before it actually collapsed. So why, better together, think we should listen to Alistair and take his advice on the Scottish economy really is beyond me. And I've had to analyse what's happening in the United Kingdom. And I hesitate to say this in front of a professor. But we have to take it in its historical context. We have been part of what I call the English/British Empire from 1707 onwards. Every empire has its period of ascendancy and its period of decline and fall. Back to the Persians, Alexander the Great, the Romans, the Spanish, the Portuguese. And it's happening to what was the British Empire. We're in the final stages of decline. If you want proof of that, take the Royal Navy. I had 5.5 years I served in the Royal Navy. We had a home fleet, a Mediterranean fleet, a Far East fleet, and a West Indies station. The Royal Navy today has 19 warships only. 2 aircraft carriers have been built. They only have enough ability in terms of finance to put a crew on one, and they haven't any of the money for aircrafts until 2020. The second aircraft carrier, they don't know what to do with it because the Royal Navy haven't enough people to put a crew on it, never mind the aircraft. They would like to sell it, nobody will take it unless Argentina would take it, but they can't sell it to Argentina. And if you think of the Queen's Jubilee, that was the real giveaway, let me tell you. Up the Thames in a wee boat with the Duke of Edinburgh in the full gear of an admiral of the fleet. Every Jubilee for a monarch in the past, including this one, has reviewed the fleet. But there's no fleet to review. That's why they were up the Thames in a wee boat. And that's indicative. But when you look at the bigger picture, the UK national debt at the present time is £1.3 trillion. And it's heading towards £1.5 trillion by 2017. The Chancellor this year has had to borrow £100 billion. If we vote no, and the election for Westminster is held next year, in which we are involved, the Tories are going to cut public services in the UK by £25 billion. If Labour were elected by some miracle, Ed Balls has said he'll do exactly the same. Maybe tinker a wee bit, but essentially exactly the same. And if you think we have experienced austerity up until now, you wait to see what's coming. Because it's in the final stages of economic decline as well as political decline. So I've had to analyse that for my grandchildren, and I've had to tell each one of them, if we vote no, and we stay in that declining United Kingdom, the best advice I can give you as your grandpa is to get the best skill level or the best academic qualifications if you're going to university in order to get out to Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Because of no vote means Scotland remains a country of low wages, zero contract and gross inequality. Now I shouldn't need to tell my grandchildren that. And I came out of retirement to campaign in this election or referendum. I came out because I'm campaigning not just for my grandchildren, but for your children and your grandchildren as well. I don't want to be sitting in my living room on a Hogmanay, getting a telephone call from a grandchild from New Zealand wishing his grandpa a happy new year. I want him in my living room, in my house, in my country. That's what I want. And there's nothing wrong with wanting that. Now, I haven't always been in favour of independence. I've been utterly, fundamentally opposed to it. When I was elected a Labour MP in South Ayrshire in 1970, in Ayrshire I was known as the hammer of the nationalists. I was a British unionist. I was brought up in the British trade union movement. I believed it, absolutely, totally believed it. Then I went to Westminster. And after about a couple of years, I began to wonder. So I sat down and I wrote myself a long memorandum. Now, anybody who's known the audience who thinks we're all daft on the yes side, that's the proof. Write to yourself. And I argued with myself. And my conclusion in that memorandum was that I wasn't just a wee bit wrong, I was wholly wrong. That being a full sort of part of the United Kingdom as we stood then was absolutely against Scottish interests. In the last bit of that memorandum, I said to myself, what are you going to do about it? Now, I could have kept my trap shut. I had the biggest majority in Scotland, 16,000 in South Ayrshire. And I don't want to paint myself as a saint, but I was brought up in the Labour movement in Ayrshire, where we believed that we had a responsibility to the working people who elected us. And therefore I thought it was my responsibility to try and start changing the policy. Let me tell you, it's not easy. It's an intellectual nightmare when you discover that you've been wrong about something you really believed in. So I did a kind of sneaky thing intellectually. I moved to devolution. You know, that sort of compromise. We had a Scottish Assembly, but still inside the United Kingdom. Then I began to realize, once you move from the straitjacket of the Union into a better mentality in devolution, you begin to think things that you couldn't think before. The problem I found in devolution is that there is in fact power retained. That's what Enoch Powell defined it, he was quite right. Also, there were limits to what we can do. No matter how much devolution you get, it's limited. And so I would find myself thinking of a policy and then saying, oh, can't you do that? That's in devolution. My journey from a British unionist to someone who believed in independence took 12 years. It was that kind of journey. Labour voters in Scotland haven't got 12 years to make that kind of journey. You've got to face up to your responsibility, I'm telling people, in a very short space of time. The next remark I want to make is a quotation from Margot MacDonald, and it's relevant to what I want to say later. Out of self-respect comes self-confidence, and out of that comes imagination, innovation, and the whole world opens up with independence. Nothing big and brave ever came from creeping along. It's time to be bold, time for independence. And then to bear those in mind. I'd like you to bear those words in mind. I want to talk to you about currency, and also I want to talk to you about oil, but perhaps in a different way from the previous speakers. There's a great deal of confusion on currency. I am not in favour of a currency union, because a currency union is a treaty between two foreign countries to set up a single currency with a single central bank. We are 5 million people, 55 million people south of the border. I don't think that's in our interest. I don't want the Bank of England to have anything to do with Scottish public policy. That's one factor that's inevitable. But I want to be fair to Alex Salmond. It is a viable proposition, and it is in England's interest to take that. Because if we become independent, and we are not in a currency union, all those exports that young Scott told us about are no longer calculated in the United Kingdom, or let's call it England because that's the main population. It's no longer calculated in their balance of trade. And their balance of trade, unlike ours, is always in chronic deficit. So it would be a major problem for them if we are independent and we're not in a currency union. So when they say that they're going to make a manifesto pledge, that if we vote yes in September, and we start to negotiate independence, and they have an election in 2015, they have a manifesto pledge that they will refuse a currency union. That is not a rational decision on their part, it's more like spite against us voting yes. However, of that, Alec is perfectly correct in what he says. I don't agree with it because of the role of the Bank of England. The use of sterling. The No campaign have managed to confuse people on this by saying we won't let you use the pound. George Osborne can't stop anybody in the world using the pound. When a Japanese tourist comes to play golf at St Andrews, what does he use? He uses sterling. When a German tourist comes here, he uses sterling. When we go to Spain, we use the euros. We don't phone up the central bank of the euro in Frankfurt and say, please, we'd like to have 100 euros, is that okay? It's a natural thing. These are international tradable currencies. That's the jargon of the economist. In effect, anybody can use them anywhere in the world. The problem with using sterling in the long term is that you're using a foreign country's currency, and you have absolutely no control over what happens to it. If they devalue, you devalue. If they push it up, your exports become more expensive. But you can use it. My attitude is, yes, during the initial transitional period as we move into independence, let us use sterling for 1 or 2 years. And during those 1 or 2 years, we build up our own central bank and our own ability to manage our currency. And we can peg it to sterling 1-to-1, so that there's no tradable problem whatsoever. But that's a sovereign decision of ours. It's a sovereign decision to peg it, and it would be a sovereign decision to unpeg it if it came to be in our interest to do so. So let me explain very clearly. That ballot paper on the 18th Disney asks you to endorse Alex White paper. When we vote for independence, the sheet is open to all options on currency. And it's the Scottish Government we elect in 2016, and we don't know what it will be. It's the Scottish Government in 2016 who will decide between those three options. And you and me, in that election leading up to 2016, as electors, we're going to have our say in which options we want. So I want to sort of clarify the currency issue. The second issue is oil. Suppose last Wednesday, you and me won the lottery. But I've got one ticket, and you're a syndicate, and you've got one ticket. My million is far more valuable to me than your million split between everybody in here. It's exactly the same with oil. There's 21 billion barrels of oil left in the North Sea. And you've already heard about the other finds that are taking place. That amount of oil for 5 million people is far more valuable than it is for 60 million people, just like the lottery money. We can do more with it in this 5 million population than they can do, or we can do as part of a 60 million. The other thing is, there's 40 million tonnes of oil pass through Scotland every year. The amount that we use domestically, for all purposes, for cars and lorries and the trains and everything, we only use 10,241 tonnes of that 40 million. My grandson, who's a scientist, tells me, and I believe him, that means 0.02% of that oil. That's all. If we took 0.05% of that oil, I'm talking about the black stuff, I'm not talking about the taxation, I'm talking about the actual black stuff itself, and put it through Grangemouth and slashed the price of fuel for everybody in this country, we have a stimulus to our economy which is quite remarkable. Everybody locally, more money in their pocket to spend locally. Our tourist industry, and we get a big share of our tourist industry from across into the Northern England. Most of them never go beyond the Glasgow-Edinburgh line because of the cost of fuel. Number do, but the biggest proportion stays this side. Just think, if this was a really low-cost fuel area, we would stimulate our tourist industry here and take it beyond the Glasgow-Edinburgh line, creating jobs. Think what that would also do to the farming industry, for example. I was over at Campbellton earlier in the week, and a farmer got up, and he says his biggest problem, if you think of the geography of Campbellton, coming by road, his biggest problem was the cost of access to markets. Huge cost for them down there. Slash the price of their fuel, and he becomes highly competitive in accessing the markets. And if we slash the price of jet fuel, then there's a great chance for Prestwick Airport, for example, up in the West Coast, which we now own but really don't know what to do with, to become a centre for aircraft come for maintenance and also come to get loaded up. So you begin to solve the problem of Prestwick. Our trucking industry, and we've got, because of our geography, our trucking industry have very heavy fuel factor in their business. Slash that and become one of the most effective anywhere in Europe. So with just one wee policy change to take tiny, tiny proportion of that black stuff, we can stimulate jobs and infrastructure in our economy. Think of the difference that would make in the rural areas of Scotland, who pay a very heavy price for their cars and everything else that go along with it. And it would be almost costless, because we'd only be taking 0.05% of the 40 million tonnes. I also want to tell you about, it's already been alluded to, the oil and gas in the Firth of Clyde. Chick Brodie is an MSP, comes to here. Chick delved into the National Archives. He's got files about that length. When I was an MP in Ayrshire, and my colleague David Lambie for Central Ayrshire, we had heard rumours about them doing tests for oil and gas in the Clyde. But there was no freedom of information in those days. So the government could put blanks up against us. But Chick had heard about these rumours. Some older men came along to him and said, I'm telling you, son, you know, there's something out there they're not telling us about. So into the National Archives he went, and he found all the scientific evidence that there is huge deposits of oil and gas in the Clyde, and oil and gas in the Solway Firth as well. But the real hand grenade that he found was a letter dated 1983, which referred to a letter on the 17th of September 1981 from a man called Roger Mansell. Now, I'd never heard of him. You have never heard of him. He was never elected by anyone. But what Roger Mansell had written in 1981 to the Department of Energy was a letter forbidding any possibility of exploiting the oil and gas in the Firth of Clyde. He told them under no circumstances can there be any oil rigs in the Firth of Clyde, because he wanted to sail what was then the Polaris submarine safely up the Clyde, past the Isles of Craig, into open water. Now it's the Trident. We were kept in total ignorance of that resource. And we only know it now because Chick Brodie dug out the letter. Now, remember that date, 1981. That's when Margaret Thatcher's government was destroying the industrial base of Scotland. So there we were, onshore being destroyed, and offshore there was a new industry able to be born that we were kept in total ignorance of. Nobody should be surprised. Nobody should be surprised that Cameron flew to Shetland, and nobody should be surprised when they tell us there's no oil there either. We've been in a prison of lies on oil since the very start. There's a guy called Dr. Gavin McCrone, who in 1973, he was the chief economist of the Scottish office, wrote a memorandum for the government in which, among various things, he said that given the amount of oil that was there and could be got, an independent Scotland would be highly prosperous. When he was saying that, politicians at Westminster were telling the Scottish people, come on, the Isle will no last 10 years if you're lucky. They knew what the position was and were denying it. Janie Buchan, who was a Labour member of the European Parliament, actually went on television and said it can't be Scotland's oil because we didn't put it there. Now, the last 15 years of my working life was in the Arab world, principally in the Gulf. And I would tell my Arab colleagues about this, and they'd laugh and say, well, we didn't put it there either, but you can see what we've done with it. So there we are. If we get rid of Trident, then we have a new industry in the Clyde in which the men at Govan Shipbuilders and at Scotstoun don't need to worry about being bribed or blackmailed over a warship. Oil rigs, supply vessels. That's the kind of future. Now, I'm in Eyemouth tonight, and you know the difference between Eyemouth and some of the places I've been in the last 2 days in the Central Belt are heartbreaking. Parts of Edinburgh and many parts of Glasgow are full of people crushed with poverty. Absolutely crushed by it. You know, poverty is not just a lack of material circumstances. Poverty crushes the soul of people as well. And I've stood in the back of the Margot Mobile and watched damaged people all over the place. Food banks have been mentioned. About 4 weeks ago, a woman called Julie Webster in the Maryhill Food Bank told about a woman and her 2 children who came in on a Tuesday. They had had nothing to eat since the previous Friday. When they come in, they were looking for cans with a ring pull so they could get their fingers into the beans and start eating. They were so hungry. Now we should be ashamed of that. Utterly ashamed that that can happen in our country. There are people who are doing all right. I'm okay. You know, I've got a good state pension. I've got a parliamentary pension from my days at Westminster. I'm okay. But what about the people who are not okay? The other day, the Daily Record produced the evidence. God knows why they think it's better together when they produce this kind of evidence. They produced the evidence that £100 million is being cut off the benefits of disabled people. And they published a photograph of a lassie in a wheelchair who's got multiple sclerosis. And if her benefit in terms of transport is cut, she's confined to her house forevermore. Forevermore. We wouldn't vote for that. The bedroom tax has been mentioned. We've got old people sitting in their homes. Now that's homes, not their houses, in their homes, which is different. They've had those homes for 30 or 40 years. They've brought in newborn babies. They've watched the wean crawl, then learn to walk, go to school, become an adolescent, become an adult. All the family memories are wrapped up in that home. And they're sitting there terrified because the Tory government in London says they've got a spare bedroom. And either they get out or they face a financial penalty. Now you and I, nobody in Scotland that I know of would ever dream of voting for policies like that. We've got 250,000 children living in poverty in Scotland. The Lidl stores all over Scotland have a big billboard outside the entrance, and it's got hearts on it. They're co-sponsors of STV's Poverty Appeal. And the first words are, 1 in 5 Scottish children live in poverty. Now, we're the 14th richest country in the world. The Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development monitors the economies of every country in the world, and it publishes a complete table. We are 14th among the richest in the world. The UK is down to 18th. So we've got to ask ourselves, how is it possible in such a rich country that a lassie's got to have a pool can in order to get her fingers into a can of beans because her and her children are starving? How is it possible that we allow payday loan companies to charge 4,500% interest rates on the very poorest in our society? Well, a Labour voter said to me, that's the Tories, Jim, that's what the Tories do. And I said, can he deny that? But we let them do it. We have a responsibility. We let them do it, so we're responsible for what in fact is happening to our people. And the only way that we can use the wealth of the 14th richest country in the world for all of our people is by going independent. The Duke of Buccleuch last week gave a big chunk of money to the No campaign. Do you think he gave that money because he's concerned about the lassie who had to go to the food bank? No, no. One of the biggest landowners in our country, who's never paid a penny on the land that he controls, knows full well that come independence, his game is up. Now, I ask you to bear in mind Margot's words about self-confidence and imagination. The tactic of the No campaign now is no different than it was in 1979 and throughout my life. That has been to crush the self-confidence of the Scottish people, to tell us we're too weak, and we're too poor, and we're inadequate to run our own affairs. We've been trapped in the myth of our inadequacy for years, years and years. I went through the referendum in 1979, and unlike now, I was talking to terrified audiences. They put folk on a train at King's Cross to Edinburgh, and when it passed Berwick, they put on customs officers' uniforms and went round demanding passports, because that was how it's going to be if in fact we voted yes. The Daily Express published a leader in January 1979 and said if you vote yes, Linwood would go, Bathgate would go, Ravenscraig would go, Clodpack would go, and the game's a bogey. Well, they all went, and we didn't get the Assembly. We had Alec Douglas-Hume, 2 days before the poll, went on television and said, this Assembly is made good enough for Scotland. We'll give you a better one. And what he gave us was Margaret Thatcher. So we've had this before. And they ran Project Fear in this campaign to crush the self-confidence of people in Scotland. Well, I don't think they have in fact succeeded. Now I'm addressing audiences like this all over the country. We're engaged in the greatest civic movement that Scotland has ever seen. And it's also a great self-education movement. All over Scotland there are yes campaigns. Some people in politics are in them, but most people have never been involved in politics in their life. They're learning about economics, they're learning about social policy, they're learning about education policy, and they're learning how to organise themselves. It's the greatest thing that has ever happened in Scotland. And when we're independent, as I discovered as I moved from a unionist to a devolutionist to independent, when we are independent, we can think of doing what we want, and nobody can stop us. And Margot mentioned imagination. And when I wrote that book of mine, I thought, what would I do if I was writing a programme and I didn't need to bother about anybody south of the border telling me I can't do it? One of the things I suggested, some of my friends said, no, too outlandish, Jim, folk will mock it, but I kept it in. It's about how we deal internationally. We have a martial history. And lots of us are very proud of the regiments marching up and doing and all the rest of it. But if you look at the reality, we went out to kill people on behalf of the British Empire. That's what we did. And I thought, well, we could be different. See that aircraft carrier? That's taken one they can't sell. It's not an asset, so we'll take it for nothing. And I modelled it on a 16,500 ship called the Africa Mercy, which is a hospital ship that takes medical care to poor African areas which have no medical cover. It does over 3,000 surgical operations a year, 16,500 tonnes. It goes into African areas where people have got cataracts, removes them, people can suddenly see again, wanes with cleft palates, improves it. Just think of the difference it makes to those individual lives when that happens. And I thought, well, why don't we do that? Why don't we take the second aircraft carrier and instead of sending it out into the oceans with our young men and women to kill people, let us convert it into a hospital ship and an international rescue ship, full of doctors, nurses, medical care, water and everything you need for an international disaster. People say, what can we, Scotland, do in the world? Well, we can do that. We can start healing people instead of killing people. We can bring medical care to people who don't have it. Independence opens the door to every thought you ever had. We can think afresh and think anew with independence. That's why I'm going to vote yes, and I'm asking you to vote yes on the 18th. I want to quote two different women. One quote showing the negativity of the no campaign, and the other quote to inspire us to a yes. The first quote is from Joanne Lamont on the 25th of February in the STD debate. We are not genetically programmed to make political decisions in Scotland. The other quote is from Margot MacDonald.
This is our time of reckoning. We've got to take it, and if we don't take it, we are consigning our children to much less than we've had. To narrow horizons, lower aspirations, we are consigning our children to being small, where we should be giving them a much bigger world in their own country. Margot McDonald.